Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who is tuning in from all around the world. We are glad to welcome you to tonight's episode of Stories and Myths. I'm here with the incomparable John C. Farrell. How are you this evening, John C. Farrell?
I like these descriptions you're giving me, the incomparable. Well, can I put that on my business card?
Okay.
John, the incomparable Farrell.
I like it.
So,
and you could get a cape. Just don't get any tights, please, for the love of God.
I will save everyone that pain.
Thank you.
But I am doing well. I'm excited to be back and raring to go. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm also excited to be back, but it has been a very productive 2 weeks.
Awesome.
2 weeks ago, I was a keynote speaker and a teacher at the Blue Ridge Christian Writers Conference, Blue Ridge Mountains, I should say, Christian Writers Conference in Asheville, North Carolina, at the Ridgecrest Retreat Center up in the mountains. And it was wonderful.
I love the mountains of North Carolina.
Yeah, just gorgeous. I know you went to school not too far from there, college.
Right, yeah. I went to App State for undergrad and grad school. And
so everything there, you learned how to do apps. Is that what it was?
Everything I learned at App.
You learned it. You learned to create apps at App State?
Probably not. They did not have apps when I was actually in college.
So what does app stand for then? Associated Press?
Okay, this is going to upset people because I know people outside of this area call it or pronounce it something different. But it is Appalachian State University. Yes, there is not a T, but it's still pronounced Appalachian. And it's Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains. You can call it Appalachian or whatever you want to wherever you are. You go into Boone or anywhere near Boone and call it Appalachian, you will be not always gently reminded that you are incorrect in your pronunciation.
Yeah. Well, so, I was there 2 weeks ago in the Appalachian Mountains. And
see, you did it. It's just my natural reaction to gag when people say Appalachian because that's not it.
And so once again, for those who are locals,
Kelly is 100% right. There is no long A in Appalachian. It is Appalachian, not Appalachian.
All right, go Kelly.
I agree with you wholeheartedly.
So that went extremely well. A lot of good connections, a lot of good catching up with other writers and speakers and ministers and publishers and so on. So it was really great. And then last week I was on vacation for the first half of the week.
And tell us what you did.
Well, I rested and I hiked and I did all those kind of things. I went to see the Pirates play the Dodgers.
So I was getting that.
Yeah. Because for those of you who are just tuning in, John's favorite team is the Brooklyn Dodgers, and mine is the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Okay, if you're living before 1957, yes, it would have been the Brooklyn Dodgers. But ever since 1957, it is now the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Oh, and so they moved.
I believe they pulled out the brooms and swept the Pirates. And actually,
a lot of people sweep the Pirates.
Good point. But actually, one of the Pirates players actually hit a home run, but ended up being an out because he.
Why was it an out? I watched this with my eyes.
I watched
because Hayes hit the home run, which we were all woo, and in his excitement, he forgot to step on first base.
Rookie mistake. That is the most Pirates thing that could ever happen.
Yeah. I want to remind you that the Pirates have won, I think, 5 world championships. 5. So they are coming back.
But you want to know what's funny?
They're coming back.
You want to know what's funny? I'm in my mid-40s. I have not seen one of them happen since I've been alive.
That's not true. You were born in 1976. And they won the World Series in 1979. We are family. Willie Stargell, here, cranking up his elbow. I watched that live, my friend. And I remember.
I can be assured, you can be assured that I did not watch that live, and I did not
So
watch that.
besides watching the Pirates lose in a humiliating fashion,
But you have better news. You have better news,
Brooklyn
right?
Dodgers, then later that week, I co-officiated on the shores of Lake Erie at sunrise my son's wedding to my lovely daughter-in-law, and that was really, really a special occasion. But
awesome.
I'm glad to be back here for Stories and Myths, because we're going to talk about my new book that just came out before I went to Blue Ridge, and that is Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. But we're also going to talk about another, what I call a back burner project, where I'm just doing the preliminary research for a project that probably will come out in 2022 or 2023, and that will be on Little Round Top in the Battle of Gettysburg. So we're going to talk about Little Round Top as well. So what do we got coming out of the gate?
So we're going to talk a little bit about Grant's faith, and then we're also going to talk about his strategic thinking.
Okay.
And you're going to give some examples of that. So we got a great lineup tonight, and so I'm excited to get right into it.
Absolutely.
You ready, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right. So first question, many people wonder whether Grant was a person of faith. And you have a chapter in your new book for the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant. Shameless plug. Show your book. So there's a chapter that examines his religious background. What were your conclusions for those who have not read it? Have faith in God and family.
In God and family. Chapter 13 of Forward, the leadership principles of U.S. Grant. I opened this chapter with a quote. What had happened is a group of Sunday school teachers had created like a national union of Sunday schools. And this was during the Grant presidency. And they asked Grant if he would give an endorsement for their Sunday school movement. And this is what he said. Now, Grant was called the Sphinx because he was a man of few words. But when he did say something, you knew it was coming from his heart, and quite often they were zingers. And this is one of those things.
Can I pause you right quick? Kelly has commented and saying that audio is not good and she cannot hear you.
Okay, if we could have a comment from someone else to confirm, because it might be Kelly's connection.
Or is it coming mainly when I speak, or is it coming mainly when Craig speaks? So we can, if it's something on our end, we can kind of try to figure that out as well.
Everything to me is sounding just fine. So we'll see.
So
if someone else can comment to let us know if their audio is good or not good, that would be helpful. But let's continue.
Okay.
So Grant responded and he said this. Joan said, sound is fine for me. So Kelly, it's probably on your end. So let's continue. Grant responded to the Sunday School Union and he said, hold fast to the Bible as the sheet anchor of your liberties. To the influence of this book, we are indebted for all the progress made in true civilization. I don't think that you can get any more clear than that. It's interesting because I read probably 25 or more books about Ulysses S. Grant in preparation for these projects. And there were a couple of authors who, in my opinion, showed their own bias and read into Grant's life by saying that he was not very religious or didn't have a strong faith. Whereas other writers, in particular Ronald White, he said that he saw faith all over the place with Grant. And I agree. And so in this chapter, I talk about the different places where we see Grant's faith. So for example, and because I'm at the age that I am, I'm going to put on my glasses here to.
Well, I do have a question for you, and you can answer this after you get ready after you finish reading. But of the people who did not think he had faith, what were some of the reasonings behind their assumption that he had no faith? And you don't have to answer that now, but
let's come back to that.
Yeah.
All right. So the opening words of Grant's memoirs,
thank you, Kelly,
is it gives us insight into his worldview, because the very first thing that he wrote in his personal memoirs was a quote from 11th century Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas. And he said, quote, "Man proposes and God disposes. There are but few important events in the affairs of men brought about by their own choice." And it could be this viewpoint that Grant had that was almost a fatalistic view, that there's very little control that we have in our own lives, but that what happens to us just happens, and all we could do is kind of go along with it. And so some people may have seen that as a lack of faith. I don't see that as a lack of faith. I see it as a realistic kind of faith, because there are some people where they look at faith as a Pollyanna kind of thing, where everything's going to be good as long as I have faith in God. Well, that's not what the Bible says. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. And the Bible says, many are the afflictions of the righteous. But then it gives that contrast and says, but the Lord will deliver you out of them all. Now, how he delivers you is up to him, but he will deliver you out of those troubles. And I think that that's what Grant really believed. Grant was a good Methodist. His mother was a very pious, quiet Methodist. His father was bombastic, but his mother was just the opposite. She was very quiet, and Grant followed after his mother, was much more like his mother than like his father. And he learned from her to be humble and to be a person of few words. And so that's how Grant, that was partly, I think, his personality, but also partly his religious upbringing caused him and taught him to value humility and to value choosing your words carefully. The Grants were regular attenders at church, and some of his very best friends, like John Hyle Vincent, for example, who was his pastor in Galena, Illinois. Vincent went on to found what was called the Chautauqua Movement and the Chautauqua Institute, which is in Western New York, which was a Methodist camp that was meant to mix religion with science and teaching. And so basically to have a rational faith and a balance between the two. And we know that people are always going back and forth between those two. Some people are very religious, and we call them kind of spooky spiritual, and then others are so rationalistic that you wonder if they have any faith at all. Grant, I think, struck a very strong and good balance between those two. And now Julia Grant was the granddaughter of a Methodist minister, and she was very religious, very godly. She prayed all the time. She would have their pastor come over to their house and pray for them. And that was especially true when Grant was dying of cancer. Julia sent for their pastor, Reverend Newman, who had been the chaplain of the Senate, and he was a pastor of a major, would have been a first mega church, one of the first mega churches in American history.
Wow.
In Washington, D.C., and then also in New York City. But he was visiting, vacationing on the West Coast as Grant was dying of cancer. Ulysses was dying of cancer. And so Julia sent for him, and he left his vacation and came to be with the Grants. Mark Twain didn't like Reverend Newman, partly because Twain was a bit of a cynic himself, and he kind of grappled with God because of many of the tragedies that happened in Twain's life. And also just because of his personality. He had more of a cynical personality.
Yeah. And he writes about that in letters.
In several books and short stories as well.
Yeah, he's absolutely.
And in his autobiography, he also talks about he had a faith in God, but it was always questioning because of the evil in the world. And a lot of people, struggle with that. And it's understandable to struggle with that question. And so Mark Twain looked at Newman, and Newman was a man of very strong faith. And so he would go and make these declarations to the cynical newspaper reporters and saying things like, well, it is the prayers of the people, because tens of thousands of people are praying for Ulysses S. Grant. And it's the prayers of the people God is hearing, and that's why Grant is being sustained. Well, Mark Twain was like, no, we're happy for the prayers, but it's probably more the medical science of the doctors. And so again, it's that balance between the two. We know in looking at Scripture today, at least this is my take, is that God uses it all. God can intervene supernaturally and bring healing in someone's life. I've seen it. I know a man who was dead. I know this man, very good friend of mine. He was dead. He was clinically dead. He was out, not breathing for, I don't remember what it was, 12 minutes or something like that. Wow. He was clinically dead. He was brain dead when he got to the hospital. And yet people around the world were praying for him. And a few days later, he woke up. He recovered extremely rapidly. And now he's continuing. He's a minister and he's out there speaking. His name is Jim DeMont. So miracles can happen. We've seen it.
The power of prayer.
Can't understand it. Right. Power of prayer. But on the other hand, God also can use medicine. God can use surgery. God can use sleep and nutrition to bring healing into our lives. And that is what I think is the balance. And I think that's how Grant approached things. Although he did question Newman. Newman had said something to him about God's healing, and Grant said, can God heal cancer? And Newman didn't answer. He just let it sit there, which sometimes that's the best thing to do. In the end, Ulysses S. Grant, despite the prayers, died of cancer. And we see that happen every day. So these things are in God's hands. We look at what the Scripture says and we follow that in faith. But in the end, it's in God's hands. So Grant was a man of faith. He was amused by Julia's hyper faith because she was big time believer. And he thought that was kind of funny, but he respected it. He never spoke down to it. He just thought it was cute, and he loved it about his wife. So, for example, they were in Jerusalem, and at the church, I think it was of the Holy Sepulchre, there was a God bless you, may you go and sneeze no more. There was a sign. God bless you, God bless you, God bless you.
I usually sneeze 3 in a row, just to let you know.
All right, well, we're all prepared. Everyone out there, just be prepared. But they were at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I believe. And there was a sign that said, any pilgrim that will lift up a prayer for Pope Pius will gain entrance to heaven, which of course is an unbiblical thing to write. That's not what Jesus' death and our faith in his resurrection is what gains us entrance to heaven.
It's an interesting take. Is incorrect.
It's a religious take, but it's not a biblical take.
Right.
At any rate, Julia fell immediately to her knees and started praying for Pope Pius. And Grant thought that was amusing, and he turned to John Russell Young, who was a reporter who was covering the trip and writing for the newspaper, and he said, Julia never misses a chance. And in other words, she never misses a chance to make, points for heaven. The same thing when Grant was dying. He never hindered the prayers that were going on in the house because he knew that they made Julia feel better. And I believe that there was some faith there in Grant as well. Although, like I said, he was very much a realist, and he looked at his situation as more than likely a death sentence, which is what it was. Well, in the end, Grant was a believer, and the Grant family were committed Christians.
Well, so I have a question. Did Julia's or any of his his kids' faith get shaken or tested when he passed away? Or was it just as strong and fervent as ever when he passed away? Specifically talking about Julia's.
Julia was a rock.
Okay.
No,
Even beyond it. Okay.
no, it didn't. She was saddened by it, but as Job said, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I think that was Julia's position as well. So what was the other? Yeah, good song. What was the other question that you had?
That I asked you earlier?
Yeah. Why they thought that Grant didn't have faith?
The ones who were not of the belief that he had faith. What were the reasonings behind that?
Well, I think one of them was, questioning Newman, saying, can God heal cancer? Some might look at that as a lack of faith. I look at the entire life. And so that one statement, especially in the midst of the bankruptcy that he had just recently gone through, his concern about his wife and family being cared for, and the excruciating pain that he was going through, I totally understand that question.
Right.
And as a former hospital chaplain myself, I've had a lot of people ask that question. They were people of faith, but they were questioning why they were going through this particular illness that sometimes led to death. And that's a valid question. Absolutely. It doesn't mean you've given up on your faith. God is not nervous about our questions. And in fact, as the Psalms show, he actually, I think, is very open to us lifting up laments, lifting up questions, even lifting up doubts, because he wants it to be real.
And he'll show you often the answers in his own time, though.
That's right.
To those doubts and to those questions. So I could go on to my next question. That's about his strategic thinking. Are you okay with that?
I am more than okay.
All right. So when Grant became head of all the Union armies, he had all the resources at his hands that all his predecessors had, but they all failed and he succeeded. So you mentioned in the foreword that success came to the Union because of Grant's strategic thinking. I was wondering if you could share with us some of those examples of his strategic thinking that helped him succeed when others had failed and before him.
Absolutely. I think it's important to note that from the very beginning of the war and the very first commander, General McDowell, at First Manassas or Bull Run, the Union Army of the Potomac had all of the human resources, the men that they needed. They were always larger than the Army of Northern Virginia. They always had way more supplies. And if the men were killed or wounded, they were reissued. New people came in all the time. So when you go through the list, McDowell, and then to McClellan, and then to Pope, and back to McClellan again, and then to Burnside, and then to Meade, they all had the same resources that Ulysses S. Grant had when he came to power after all of them were not able to beat Lee. And so you have to look at what was it that he brought to bear that was different than what the other commanders brought to bear. And in my view and in my writing or in my research, it became very clear and very obvious that it was Grant's strategic thinking working in tandem with Abraham Lincoln's strategic thinking. The two of them saw eye to eye very much. Now, Grant had the West Point training that Lincoln didn't have. And so when Grant and Lincoln first met to talk about strategy, Lincoln brought out this idea and said, you're the general and I'm releasing it to you to run the battles, but here's an idea to think about. And he laid this idea out for Grant, and Grant immediately saw that it would be a disaster. It would have been the possible ruin of the Army of the Potomac, because Lincoln didn't study at West Point and didn't have at that point 20 years almost of experience in the military. Grant did. Mm-hmm. But Grant also just innately thought strategically. And so he explained to Lincoln what the problem was with the plan, and Lincoln rolled up his plan and said, well, thank you. Let's go with your plan. Because he immediately, when Grant explained it to him, he saw, oh, yeah, that's probably, maybe I was not thinking it through enough.
He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and he very much did. And so that is why, to this day, military colleges, they teach the strategy that Grant developed for the Battle of Vicksburg to this day. And so it is a very interesting thing to note that many people thought that Vicksburg could not be taken. And when Grant presented his plan to Sheridan, or not Sheridan, but to Sherman and McClernand and the other generals there that were with him going against Vicksburg, Sherman not only came against it, but he wrote a letter and said, I am writing this letter to voice my opposition to this plan because I don't think that it's going to work, and it actually could be dangerous. And Grant simply said, I acknowledge it. I received the letter. Thank you very much. Put it into his trunk, or wherever, it may have gone to the War Department. I don't know. But wherever it went, it just went. And Grant continued with his plan. And his plan was this. Vicksburg was surrounded it has very steep hills that go from the city down to the Mississippi River. And so no army could get up those hills without being blown away by the soldiers and the artillery at the top of the hill. And the U.S. Navy tried to bombard over those hills and couldn't get the range. It couldn't get up high enough. And so it was on the north side, there were all these rivers and these bayous. And then on the eastern side, the Confederates had built all of these fortifications. And so the only way to get to Vicksburg was to come through the south, but the Union Army was on the north side, and no one could figure out a way to get around to the south to attack from down below. So everybody thought that it was impenetrable except Grant. And Grant came up with the idea, and this is what they still study to this day. He said, if we will cut loose from our supplies and live off of the land and move quickly, we can get ahead of the Confederates, and they will be caught by surprise, and we can win. And that was the thing that Sherman was like, at West Point, we learned you never cut yourself off from your supplies. Right. And Grant was saying, no, this is a new day, and this is what we're going to do. And so they went ahead, and the other thing was that Grant had two different diversions that he sent forth as he was moving his troops down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi. They were on the other side. They had spent months drying everything out and building roads and bridges so that the Union Army could go down that side without being seen by the Confederate forces on the Mississippi side. I mean, the Mississippi State side.
Right, yeah.
So while Grant was moving his troops down, he sent off this cavalry commander, and I can't think of his name right now, but he went around the eastern side, and he basically was making noise and like stealing, guns and ammunition and things like that. It was mostly a nuisance. Now, they did have some interaction with the Confederate pickets that were way out front on those embattlements and on the hillsides, but for the most part, it was all about creating a diversion, and it worked because Pemberton, who was the commander in Vicksburg, his full attention went that it was like Sauron, whose attention was just sent in a different way, so he wouldn't see Frodo. That's exactly what it was, and so this cavalry commander went all the way through Mississippi, and then came out on the southern side in Louisiana with hardly any injuries and casualties, whereas they inflicted a lot of injuries and casualties on the Confederates. But the most important thing was that it diverted the attention of the Confederates. The other thing is that Grant sent Sherman, who had attacked northwest of Vicksburg, coming off the Mississippi River onto that hillside. He had attacked there back in December of 1862. This is now 1863. And so Grant sent him to the exact same location and said, attack again, but don't get your soldiers in any danger. Just pretend that you're attacking. So while the Union cavalry was diverting on the eastern side, Sherman was diverting the attention of Pemberton on the northwestern side. And all the while, Grant and the rest of the Union Army of the West was traveling down the Louisiana shore and totally fooled them. And they didn't find out about this. Several pickets down south of Vicksburg started sending cables to Pemberton saying, there's a lot of Yankees over there. And Pemberton was like, I'm not worried about them. I'm looking at these other two things. That's all strategic thinking that Grant came up with. And then what happened is that Grant made an agreement with Admiral Porter of the Union fleet on the Mississippi River to take gunboats and barges and to run the gauntlet past Vicksburg. And they had this amazing battle in the middle of the night, after midnight, where they're shooting at each other, but they made it past. There was only one boat that was sunk, and all the rest got through. Some damage, but all the rest got through. And so they became then cargo ships and transports. And so this was one of the first great American Army amphibious movements. So Grant and all of, when Sherman was done with his false raid, he was the last one to come down the Louisiana side. So one corps at a time. McClernand was first, then McPherson, and then Sherman. And when McClernand got across to the other side, Grant said, go get them. And they just started immediately hammering any troops that were there. And there weren't that many because the Confederates didn't think they would be attacked from the south. And so they mowed them over. Many people thought, including President Lincoln, that Grant would move directly north to Vicksburg. But he didn't do that. He understood that the best thing to do was to cut the Vicksburg garrison off from its supplies. And so Grant took his three corps and they moved northeast towards Jackson. And they attacked Jackson, which was, about an hour, 60 miles or so. I don't know exactly, but, about an hour if you're driving it today from Vicksburg inland east.
Wow. And
they cut off the railroad. They pushed back Johnston's army, which had Johnston combined with Pemberton, they would have been larger than the Union force under Grant. And so Grant kept them separated. And he set Sherman in advance there in Jackson, facing east, so that Johnston couldn't get through, General Joe Johnston. So Johnston was trapped. He couldn't get around the Union. And so then Grant took McClernand and McPherson, and they attacked first at Champion Hill. They defeated the Confederates at Champion Hill, pushed them back behind their garrison into Vicksburg, and then it became a siege. And within just, I don't know how many weeks it was, 4 or 5, they were starving in Vicksburg, both the army and the people. They were eating horses and dogs and rats. And the Navy was shooting cannon into the city from the river, and the army was shooting from the entire city was surrounded and having shells drop. And so the people actually dug into the side of the hills and lived underground for quite a while this attack was happening. And finally, the Confederate army was so weak because they weren't eating properly that they came to Pemberton and
said,
eating
rats.
Yeah. And they came to Pemberton and said, we can't survive. You need to surrender. Well, Pemberton was originally from the Philadelphia area, and he didn't want to be looked on as a traitor to the Confederacy. He had married a woman from the South, and he joined the Confederate Army. Who knows why, but he was loyal to the Confederate Army, and he didn't want to look as being disloyal. And so he held out as long as he could. But then he had the idea that if he surrendered on the 4th of July, that they would get the best terms from Grant because it was the national holiday. And so that's what he did. And so they surrendered on the 4th of July. And the 4th of July was not celebrated in Vicksburg, I think, for the next 60 years because of them surrendering on that day. But that was the strategic plan.
Well, did he get any mercy? Did he get any mercy for?
Oh, absolutely. And immediately Grant started feeding the troops. There were people who were hoarding food, and Grant had his soldiers go and find where the food was. And they broke open these places where people were hiding food from their neighbors. And the Union Army immediately fed the people and the Confederate Army immediately. And they were
That's nice.
Grant was, he was a warrior, but as soon as the battle was over, he was very magnanimous. And in fact, that is why Southerners started to really like Grant after Appomattox because of his generous terms. And Grant was generous in all of the surrenders. And remember, Grant received the surrenders of 3 armies during the war. No one else ever came close. In fact, in American history, I don't know of any other general that has received the surrender of 3 different armies than Ulysses S. Grant. And it goes back to his strength as a strategist with regard to strategy.
Wow. Well, I'm excited about the next topic that we're going to talk about. So, as you are well aware, we're approaching the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this kind of leads into your project that you briefly mentioned at the beginning of this.
Yeah, don't tell anybody that I'm working on this. We're going to just keep this between all of us.
Yes. Don't tell anybody. So you're doing a little preliminary research on the heroes of Little Round Top.
Back burner research.
Back burner research. All right. So as a result of the movie Gettysburg, a lot of people think that the main hero of the Battle of Round Top was Chamberlain, correct? So, yes. but you say he's only one of 6. And so my question is, why was Little Round Top important in the Battle of Gettysburg? And if he's not, if there's others besides him that were so important or were heroes, who are the other 6 heroes that you plan to highlight in your back burner research?
The other 5 heroes. There were 6 altogether.
Okay, so Chamberlain is one of those 6.
Yeah,
so what
Chamberlain is and was a hero. In fact, he was decorated for bravery for what he did that day.
Right.
What he did was extremely important, but it's not as important as some people hold it up to be. It was just one of several people who did extremely brave and courageous things to hold Little Round Top. Now, without a map, it's hard to see, but basically the Union position in Gettysburg was extremely strong. And what I'm learning as I'm doing my research is that it was now I already knew this, but it was in the shape of a fish hook. So the fish hook began up in the northeast side on what's called Culp's Hill. It went up north for a little ways over and then west to Cemetery Hill. Then it moved down south across Cemetery Ridge, and then it met Little Round Top and then Big Round Top. And so that Big Round Top was like the shank, the circle and the hook at the bottom.
Right, yeah.
And so it was extremely strong. And what I've learned is that part of the reason that the Union was on that ground was that General Reynolds, who was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, had been for a while in charge of organizing the Pennsylvania Volunteer Militia. And so he had traveled throughout that area and had done surveys of that area, and he saw the strength of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill and that whole area. And so when Lee decided in late June of 1863 to turn and to invade the North again. He had done that at Antietam in 1862 against McClellan, which was pretty much a draw, although it was a little bit of a Union victory. So there were a couple of reasons why Lee decided to do that. One is that he wanted to shake up the North, and he wanted to put the Northern people into a bit of a panic, which he certainly did that. Two was that Lee had been fighting with the Army of Northern Virginia in Virginia for more than 2 years, and so there was not a lot of food left in Virginia, and also supplies. So there were literally soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia that were not wearing shoes. They didn't have shoes.
wow.
They were walking these roads. I can't even imagine it, but they were walking barefoot. And so they were looking for all kinds of supplies, coffee and salt and all the things that an army needs to survive. And so they were moving north, and the former commander of the Army of the Potomac was General Joseph Hooker. And he started following Lee to stay between Lee and Washington, D.C., but also moving into the North. Well, Hooker and Lincoln started to have disagreements. Hooker and Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, were starting to have major disagreements. They didn't like each other at all.
Oh, wow.
And so Hooker said, well, if I can't have control of this army, then I resign. And he thought that Lincoln was going to say, oh, no, you keep it there. But, Hooker had lost the Battle of Chancellorsville in a giant way. And when Lincoln got the word, he said, my God, what will the nation say? Because it was such a disaster. And so when Hooker was willing to resign, Lincoln said, okay, bye-bye. And so
that backfired.
Yeah, it certainly did. So Lincoln put George Meade into command of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade had only been in command for 3 days when they moved into Pennsylvania to follow Lee. And so what had happened is that Reynolds, his cavalry that was working with him was a general. The head of that cavalry was a general named John Buford. And Buford is the unsung hero of Gettysburg. And so Buford had been out there in front following and picking up different segments of Lee's advance columns. And he wrote back to Reynolds and he said, what do you want me to do here? Do you want me to attack? Do you want me to retreat? Do you want me to hold? What should I do? And typically the cavalry would only attack if it was other cavalry or if it was militia, but cavalry would very rarely attack infantry because infantry could just blow them over. And we need to remember that in the Civil War times, you had 2 cavalry soldiers that could fight, but the third had to hold the horses. So 1 out of every 3 cavalry soldiers couldn't fight. So your fighting force got dropped dramatically once you got off the horse. Now they could fight from the horse, but once you had to get off the horse and go against infantry, then you were losing your strength. So Buford wrote to Reynolds, and Reynolds said, do your best to hold. I'm trying to get up there as soon as possible. Now the problem was that Meade wanted to fight down below the Pennsylvania line at a place called Pipe Creek, because Meade was also from Pennsylvania, and he thought that that was a better defensive location. But Reynolds knew that Gettysburg was the place. The other thing is that Gettysburg is like the hub of a wheel whose spokes go off in every direction. And that is why Reynolds understood that Lee, knowing that the Army of the Potomac was following them, he was concentrating his army. His army had been spread all the way almost from Harrisburg over to Cashtown and Carlisle and throughout Gettysburg, the whole big wide area. But when his scouts came to him, this scout named Harrison, who was an actor, and he came to Longstreet to tell them that the Army of the Potomac was heading their way. And so when Lee found out about this, he put out word for them to concentrate. And the place that makes the most sense is Gettysburg, because they could all come down the different roads that they were on. Well, Reynolds knew that, having been from Lancaster and having charted the area. So Reynolds basically ignored Meade because he had sent him a note saying, if I'm confronted, and I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, if I'm confronted with the army, should I attack? And Meade said, do what you think is best. Well, Reynolds said, yay. That's for me, that's a blank check. So when Buford sent note to Reynolds that he was coming up against Henry Heath's infantry in his corps, Reynolds said, I'm on my way. And then Reynolds talked to General Otis Howard, and he also talked to General Dan Sickles. He sent word to General Slocum. All these armies were within striking distance, and he said, start moving towards Gettysburg. And they all did, except Slocum, who had gotten word from Meade to go to Pipe Creek. And Slocum was like, who should I listen to? And so Slocum just stayed where he was, but the others moved towards Gettysburg. And so when Reynolds got to Gettysburg, he started to attack with his First Corps. And then Howard got to Gettysburg, and he left one division of his corps on Cemetery Hill, because when they got up to Cemetery Hill and looked around, Howard turned to his associate, his second in command, and he said, I think that this is really strategic ground. And his second in command said, General Howard, I think this is the only strategic ground. And Howard said, yeah, you stay here. And then Howard took two of his forces and moved forward. Well, what happened is that Reynolds was very quickly shot in the head and killed.
Oh, wow.
On that first morning, July 1st. And that meant at Abner Doubleday, and we know that name. Some people think he invented baseball, but he didn't. He became in command. But then when Howard came on the field, Howard outranked him. So now Howard is in charge. And Howard and Reynolds the day before had talked about advancing against the enemy on McPherson's Ridge, where Buford was. But then if they had a problem, they would fall back to Cemetery Hill. And so Howard had it in his mind that they needed to fall back because what was happening is that Henry Heath's corps came in, and then A.P. Hill's corps came in, and then Richard Ewell's corps came in, and they were overwhelming the Union. So what it was is that the Confederates were coming together faster than the Union was coming together. And so they were really, the Union took a big beating on that first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederates won that day, hands down. Huh. But because of Reynolds and Howard making their plan in advance, the Union moved back onto Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and then when Meade got there, he got there at midnight that night, finally, because he had heard that Reynolds was killed and that a full-scale battle was underway. He's the head of the army. He needs to be where the battle is. So all of the Union corps, 7 different corps, started to come together there through the night. And so early in the morning, Meade started to create that fishhook line all the way around, but it ended before Little Round Top. And it ended with a guy named Dan Sickles, and his troopers called him Uncle Dan. And he was a politician general. And throughout the war, most of the politician generals were terrible generals because they didn't have the training. And so the West Point generals and officers didn't like them. So here's Dan Sickles, and Meade had put him on the south end of the fishhook just before Little Round Top. Well, Sickles had been on low ground in Chancellorsville 5-6 weeks before that, and he got really blown away by the Southerners who were on higher ground. Well, he felt like now he was on the low ground again, and he was suspicious that Meade, not liking him, had put him in a place where he would be really hurt, and it would look bad for him and for his corps. And so Dan Sickles said, I want to move forward to the higher ground. And he kept sending word back to Meade saying, I want to move forward. I want to move forward. Well, Meade was busy trying to organize the army, and Sickles was like a fly that he was swatting away, and he never answered him. So finally, Sickles said, well, I'm going to move on my own, reconnaissance. And so he moved forward to what we now know as the Peach Orchard and Emmitsburg Road. And these are very famous names because of what Sickles did. Well, when Governor Warren, who was general, and he was the head of the engineers for the Army of the Potomac, he rode out there to see what was going on. And he found out that Sickles had moved way out ahead of the rest of the army, leaving a massive gap. So Warren went back to Meade and said, we've got a problem. And so Meade called Sickles back to his headquarters. And at first Sickles didn't go. So Meade sent, I think, 3 different messengers to get him. Sickles finally came back. And by this time, Meade had heard what had happened. And he said, go back to your troops. I'll be there and we'll see what we can do. I'm going to cause, and Meade ordered General Sykes, who was the head of the 5th Corps, to move up behind Sickles to fill in that gap. But it was so late, and the Confederates were starting to move against Sickles, that it was an extremely dangerous situation. And Little Round Top and Big Round Top were completely uncovered. What does that mean? That means that if the Confederates got there first, they could put artillery up there and blow right down the Union line, and it would be Chancellorsville all over again. It was a very dangerous situation. And so it was just within minutes that everything just kind of happened. So what took place is that Governor Warren went back up and he saw that Little Round Top was uncovered. So he went up on top of Little Round Top and he could see Sickles way out there in this big gap that was, if you've been there, it included Devil's Den, it included the wheat field, and it included Little and Big Round Top, all wide open. And all of a sudden, there were some signal corps up on Little Round Top. And they said, General Warren, we think we're seeing some Confederates out there to the left of Devil's Den. That was the most dangerous place they could have been. And so Warren said to his artillery, which was down below on the cemetery ridge, he sent a message to them to fire into the woods where the Signal Corps had seen, they thought, the Confederates. And when they fired into the woods, the Confederates in the woods, just out of instinct, ducked. And when they did that, the sun shone off their bayonets and off of their guns. And Governor Warren up on Little Round Top got a fireworks show of all this glinting reflection. And he knew immediately, not only are there Confederates there, but there's a huge amount of Confederates. It was in Longstreet's entire corps had moved around the edge of the wheat field behind Devil's Den and in the woods, and they were about to attack. Well, Governor Warren knew that they were going to be in big trouble if they didn't get anybody. So he sent a message to General Sykes saying, we need a battalion up on the Rocky Hill. It wasn't called Little Round Top until after the battle. They just called it that Little Rocky Hill. And so this commander went down. Well, first he sent him down to Dan Sickles and said, can you send a battalion? Well, by this point, Sickles was fighting in the Peach Orchard along the Emmitsburg Road and then fighting in the wheat field. And it was a bloody mess. His corps just got devastated because of his foolish mistake. And so he said, I can't afford anybody. So the person came back to Warren and said, the courier came back and said, he can't send anybody. So Warren said, go to General Sykes of the 5th Division because Meade said he's on his way, and tell him we need a brigade. Well, he was on his way to General Sykes, and General Sykes said, go find General Barnes' division and get them to go up onto the Rocky Hill. So now the courier is going to find General Barnes, and he runs into a battalion that was headed by a young 26-year-old lawyer from Erie, Pennsylvania. And his name was Strong Vincent.
Yes. And
Colonel Strong Vincent saw the fear and the urgency on the face of this courier. And he said, what are your orders? And the courier said, I need to find General Barnes. Well, there's a little bit of controversy because some people think that Barnes was drinking that day. Barnes had a problem with the elbow and he would drink quite often. And some people think that he might have been drunk and that Strong Vincent was actually protecting him. Others think that Strong Vincent just saw the urgency of the situation. But whatever it was, Vincent said, "What are your orders?" And the courier finally said, "General Warren wants a brigade up on that rocky hill there." And Strong Vincent said to him, "Upon my own recognizance, I will take my brigade forward. You go tell General Sykes that that's where I'm headed." And so Vincent gave his second in command control of the brigade and said, "Lead them up there. I'm going to take my flag officer, the guy who would carry the flag so you could see where the colonel was. We're going to go up and we're going to reconnoiter the round top." So they went up to the top of this hill, which is if you've ever been there, it is a very steep climb. Yeah. And it took a little while for all of them to find a path up because there were not places for horses to go up. But Strong Vincent finally got up there and he started to look around at the ground. Well, he knew that you don't put your soldiers on top of a hill because then they're silhouetted and a very easy shot for the enemies. And so he found a ridge about halfway down the hill, and he started to make plans for his troops to be set in position there. He had 4 regiments, one from Michigan, one from New York, one from Pennsylvania, and then Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain with the 20th Maine. And so as he was making his plans, all of a sudden, sharpshooters started shooting both guns and then also artillery rounds at him. Oh, wow. And he turned and here his flag bearer standing there with a flag, which is, like the flag in a golf course. It helps you to aim, right? He said, "Put your flag behind that boulder." And so he did, and then they couldn't see him. And right about that time, the regiments arrived. And so first, Strong Vincent placed the Michigan regiment, and then the 83rd Pennsylvania, then the New York regiment, and then the 83rd Pennsylvania, which is from my hometown in northwestern Pennsylvania. And then on the very end, and you see this in the movie, he places Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and he says, "You are the end of the Union line. There's no one beyond you, so you cannot retreat. You must hold this ground at all costs." And if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, you remember that scene. Well, that was Strong Vincent. So Vincent went back up into the middle so he could see all 4 regiments. They say it was between 5 and 10 minutes that the Confederates came up that hill. That's how close it was. Wow. So it was a very deadly battle. A lot of people on both sides, Confederate and Union, were killed and wounded. At one point, Texas regiment was charging up the right-hand flank where the Michigan regiment was, and they started pushing them back, and the Michigan soldiers started to retreat. Vincent saw this out of the corner of his eye, and he went running up towards them, and he stood up on a boulder, and he shouted, "Men, turn around. This is, you'll regret this the rest of your life." So I'm paraphrasing, but basically he tried to get them to turn back, which they did. When they heard him, the Michigan soldiers turned and started fighting. But what happened is because he was up on top of this boulder, Strong Vincent became a silhouette and a very easy target. And he was shot through the pelvis and through the groin, and he fell wounded there. At that same time, there was another brigade that used to be the brigade of Governor Warren. Warren had gone back to find Sykes, and he found this brigade, which was led by a colonel named Paddy O'Rourke, who was an Irishman, and he was a great leader and a great soldier. And Warren used to be his colonel, and so he said, "I need you at the top of the hill immediately. It's an emergency." And so Paddy O'Rourke went over the back side of Little Round Top and started coming over the top just after when Strong Vincent was shot, and he saw the Michigan troops wavering, and he told his troops, Paddy O'Rourke said to his troops, "You don't have time to load, fix bayonets and charge." And so they went charging down the hill towards the Texans with their bayonets, screaming the hearty cheer of the Union soldier, which is what, the Confederates had the rebel yell. The Union had the hearty cheer of the Union soldier. And and as soon as Patty O'Rourke came over the hill, he was shot through the neck and he fell dead. But his brigade or his regiment helped to plug the hole and push the Texans back. Well, at the same time, on the top of the hill, the Union artillery had gotten into place and had unlimbered their cannons. And they knew that they couldn't get the cannons to shoot down at the people who were coming up the hill, but they could shoot over their heads at the further people. Plus, they also knew that psychologically, by shooting their cannons, that the Union troops would feel like they were stronger. And so the head of that battalion was a man named Hazlitt, and it was Hazlitt's battery, and he was fighting. And then his good friend was a man named General Weed, and General Weed came up behind Patty O'Rourke, and he saw Hazlitt there, and he stopped to kind of get an assessment for what was going on. And Weed got shot and fell to the ground, mortally wounded. And the old joke among Gettysburg people is that Weed got whacked. So Weed fell down, and Hazlitt, this was his friend, so he went over to see if he was all right, and Hazlitt got shot and fell dead on top of Weed. So that gives you your 6 heroes. The first was Governor Warren. And up until the movie of Gettysburg, Governor Warren was the hero of Little Round Top. And that is why when you go to Little Round Top, there are 2 statues on Little Round Top. One is Governor Warren on the very spot where he saw the Confederates in that wood. Right. The other statue is Strong Vincent, who was the brigadier general who basically disobeyed protocol and could have been court-martialed for it. Unfortunately, as I said, he was shot through the pelvis and the groin. He lingered for about 6 days and he died, but he was promoted by President Lincoln to brigadier general before he died. Wow. And so Brigadier General Strong Vincent has a statue there. There is no statue of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, although we know from the movie that he very bravely fought on that far left flank and kept the Alabamians back. And then when they ran out of ammunition, they fixed bayonets and they charged, and they were able to take a lot of prisoners and then push the others back over Little Round Top. And that was the end of the Battle of Little Round Top on July 2nd. And so those heroes, again, number 1 was Governor Warren. Number 2 was Strong Vincent. Number 3 was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Number 4 was Patty O'Rourke. Number 5 was General Weed. And number 6 was General Hazlitt. And those are the 6 heroes of Little Round Top. And you'll hear more about that and read more about that in 2022. Any final questions as we wrap?
No, that was very thorough and very interesting. I knew Chamberlain, and the other 5. I know a Strong Vincent because we've had those conversations about him before, but the other 4 I was not as familiar with. So it was interesting listening to all the strategy behind that and why they were the heroes. So that's cool.
And speaking of heroes, you were a heroic dad this last weekend. Tell us a little bit about that quickly.
I don't know if I was heroic, but
yeah.
So I am
any dad who takes his 2 sons to an amusement park. You're a hero.
Yeah. So there's an amusement park in Charlotte, North Carolina called Carowinds. And actually back in 94 through 1997, I worked there in the games department. And I was a games manager or a games supervisor or whatever title it is. I forget. But I worked there as a game supervisor for the last 2 years. And I actually left on August 8th, 1997. And I had not been back and in the park since that day until this past Saturday. And I have a 14-year-old and 10-year-old son or sons, and I took both of them. And it was interesting to share a little bit of my past,
of your
with
history.
my boys, my history. Yeah.
That's
with
right.
with my sons and kind of see it through their eyes, and also just marvel at all the changes that have happened in 24 years. There were a lot of new rides and new attractions there that they didn't have obviously when I was last there, but a lot of rides that were still there. Either they were rebranded, or actually some of them had actually been moved too, which I thought was kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
But it was very cool to see that. And I walked around. My oldest had been there before, and so he walked around with some of our friends who we were there with, and I walked around primarily with my 10-year-old, and who's not a huge roller coaster fan, so we rode a lot of the other attractions, and it was interesting to see the park through his eyes. And I remember when I first went there, when I was probably even younger than he was, but it was cool. I enjoyed it.
That's awesome. A heroic thing and making memories, which is so important.
I don't know if it's heroic. It
is heroic.
A dad being a dad.
John, there are so many people who don't have a father like you
True.
are. You're a good
True.
father to your kids, and
well, thank you.
That is a heroic thing. So well done.
Well, thank you so much, Craig.
All right. Well, just want to remind folks that if you're interested, you can purchase Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant, wherever books are sold. You could also buy it at grantforwardbook.com. And you'll notice right there, that is the companion book, which is the biography of the last 2 years in the life of Ulysses S. Grant. That's called Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. If you have questions that you would like for us to answer here on Stories and Myths, please send them in. Either go to my website, vonbuseck.com, or onto this Facebook page and send in your questions, and we'll be happy to take a look at those things. Now, John C. Farrell, you're not going to be with us next week. That's correct?
I will not be.
I will have a guest for next week, which will be very exciting, and we'll tell you more about that as we nail down the details. But for John C. Farrell, I am Craig Von Buseck. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Same bat time,
same bat channel.